Thanks for having me. I'm around a lot of very smart people that are much better at math than I am. My talk is not about math. It's more about how OpenSSL is used in the wild. For the last 4 or 5 years or so, I've been doing a lot of red teaming and purple teaming, so I have to do a lot of adversary emulation and things along those lines. OpenSSL is one of those tools that you always run across, especially when dealing with Linux boxes, and it's incredibly useful. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is. So I'm just going to go over ADCS and how ADCS as a PKI works a little bit differently than your standard standalone PKIs. Then we're going to get into OpenSSL and Windows security itself. We'll talk about ESC 1 through 16, what those are, and which ones we're going to be talking about. And then we're actually going to get into where OpenSSL kind of fits into kind of day-to-day red teaming and how you can also apply it blue teaming, especially if you're not a domain admin or if you're not a certificate admin or anything else like that. If you are a developer or a web application administrator, anybody who uses an application or a service that relies on tickets, you do not have to wait on your system admin or your security team in order to validate whether or not your certificates are secure. So ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services, it's the foundation of Windows PKI. It is a little bit different than your standard PKI in the fact that, as Microsoft does, it's added on a lot of its Microsoft fluff in order to make sure that ADCS works and integrates seamlessly with Active Directory. So there is kind of a misconception amongst especially Linux users that certificates are primarily used amongst smart cards in a Windows or a Microsoft environment. And while, yes, they are used with smart cards, they are used all over the place. They're used for logons, they're used for server authentication, code verification, Wi-Fi, VPN, SSO, you name it. It is built same hierarchical PKI with a root CA as well as a subordinate CA. Microsoft actually suggests that you have a root CA, however many subordinate CAs that you have, then you take your root CA offline. That way, if in the future you have an issue with your subordinate CA, something gets compromised, you can revoke that certificate and kill that chain without having to start from scratch with your root CA. It is tightly integrated, and there's an asterisk here, tightly integrated with Active Directory for auto-enrollment. And when you use that integration, it does expand the attack surface of your standard PKI infrastructure. There we go. All right, so ADCS configurations. It basically comes in 2 different modes. You have standalone mode, and that is the typical PKI infrastructure that you see pretty much everywhere else. There are some Windowsy things and Microsofty things that are included with it, but for this talk, we're mostly going to focus on enterprise mode. With enterprise mode, the CA is in a trust relationship with Active Directory. So all of the access for who has permissions to the actual certificates themselves, who has the ability to enroll, all of that's going to be associated with ACLs within Active Directory and security groups. It does support auto-enrollment, and we're going to talk about that too, in order to simplify the process. So you can bring a computer onto an Active Directory domain. You don't have to go out and create a CSR. You don't have to then say, I want a computer cert for it. Simply for its existence as an object inside of Active Directory, it will, or it can, auto-enroll and automatically get a certificate. One important thing to note in ADCS when it comes to how certificates are issued is that by default, the SAN is mapped to the user principal name of whoever the subject is or typically whoever the client is that's requesting the certificate. This is not always the case, but by default, this is the normal thing. So if I'm Bob and I request a certificate, if I request a certificate in my CSR, if I don't specify a subject or anything else like that, the certificate that I get back is going to be for Bob because I am Bob at some domain. Now, that being said, we don't have to rely specifically on the UPN. There are other things that you can rely on in order to fill that SAN field as well. So you can rely on email addresses, you can rely on DNS names, you can even rely on the container of the objects themselves within Active Directory. So you can specify that I just want CN administrator, right? And that's very useful for when people have changed names for the administrator account because the container name doesn't change. So the friendly name might change, the UPN might change, but the container is still the same. That doesn't work as much with newer systems, but it works absolutely for anything before Windows Server 2016. So there's a couple of things that are included with certificates inside of Active Directory. So in Active Directory certificate services, one thing to note is when you request a certificate, every certificate that you request is based on some predetermined template. So within that template, you have the ability to set all kind of security settings, you have the ability to set ACLs, you have the ability to set whether or not signing or additional manager approvals are required. All of that is set inside of the template so that whenever a client requests that certificate, those settings are automatically applied to that certificate. They do not have to be indicated in the CSR. Whatever's in the template is what's going to be automatically applied to that certificate. Extended key usage, known as EKUs, are basically a set of OIDs, and these OIDs are a string of numbers separated by a period that just specify what that certificate can be used for. So whether it can be used for client authentication, code signing, etc., there's an OID that correlates with that. The reason why this matters is because EKUs can both prevent a certificate from being used outside of its intended role, but it can also allow a certificate to be used outside of its intended role. So that obviously opens up an attack surface for attackers if they can find certificates that have misconfigured EKUs, or in the case of Windows specifically, if I'm on a computer, for instance, and I look at the computer certificate and I see that the computer certificate has misconfigured EKU, I know with high probability that all computer certificates which are based off of that same template also have that misconfigured EKU. So red teams exploit overly broad EKUs to escalate privileges, and at the same time, again, defenders can use these same processes in order to validate whether or not they have vulnerable certificates. You don't have to wait on your security guy. You don't have to wait on your security team. You don't have to spend $1 million on some really cool piece of software that does all this stuff for you. It's actually relatively easy to inspect your certificates, see what fields are present, see what OIDs are present, and go on from there. So, OpenSSL, it is the Swiss Army knife of PKI. I imagine that everybody in this room is at least somewhat familiar with OpenSSL, correct? It's used to generate, parse, audit, convert certificates, keys, private, public pairs, you name it, right? It can do pretty much anything. Very powerful framework. That being said, anytime there's a powerful framework, especially if it's open source, somebody's going to take it and use it for malicious purposes. So that brings us to probably the most significant red teaming tool, malicious actor tool that you can just commonly download off of GitHub right now, known as certify.exe. Certify.exe is mostly based upon the OpenSSL libraries. So all of the pieces that deal with anything dealing with certificates relies on the OpenSSL libraries. Certify actually has a lot of other functions inside of it. It's got some AD functions and things like that. We're not going to get too deep into it. I just want you to be aware that there is a tool that exists that will do the things that I'm going to talk to you about today, plus some other things as well. The issue as a red teamer, or even you as a web application administrator or something like that, you may not have the ability to just download some third-party tool. You also probably don't want to just download a third-party maliciously known tool from the internet, especially if you're not familiar with the code. It is written in Python, but it is packaged as an exe so that you can run it on Windows as well. So this kind of brings me into the use case for this talk as a whole. So as a red teamer, or even as a purple teamer, a lot of times when you first get that foothold into an environment, you don't necessarily know where you're going to land. You don't know that you're going to be on a Windows box. You don't know that you're going to be on a Linux box. I will tell you from an outside-facing standpoint, you are more likely to land on a Linux box than you are to land on a Windows box. If you're internally doing a red team, sure, Windows boxes are everywhere, but externally, it's probably going to be some kind of web application or something else like that that you end up landing in. So that being said, You may not have the permissions to install additional binaries. You may not have any kind of usernames or credentials associated with the Active Directory environment that the server that you've landed in is associated with. But most Linux operating systems do include OpenSSL. There are Windows Server versions that have partial OpenSSL libraries already installed. And for the fun part, if you have the ability to install a third-party binary, OpenSSL does not flag for anything because it is not inherently a malicious piece of software. Whereas if you were to download certify.exe on a Windows box with a good EDR that's running, it's going to flag it immediately and know that you're running that script. So I think it was 2018, Spectre Ops came out with a really good white paper that tore down the vulnerabilities around ADCS. Every single one of these escalation paths, they've numbered ESC 1 through 15. It's actually 1 through 16 now. Engineers, we have creative names, so escalation 1 through 16. This paper really significantly changed the way that Microsoft and Active Directory have really managed their templates and the way that certificates have been issued. If you look at ADCS prior to Server 2022, it looks very, very different under the hood because of this paper and because of the open source community who have contributed to it and found more escalations. So originally, the escalations that were found were 1 through 8, and then later on, they were expanded 9 through 14, and then even after that, 15 and 16 were added. With that being said, they're still adding more certificates. So if you are in the world of red teaming or purple teaming, or if you run ADCS and you are in charge of its security, this should be very familiar to you. The Spectre Ops paper here should be very familiar to you, and these ESCs should be as well. I work for a company named Netrix. We create software that helps the security in a lot of different ways, but any major software company that's out there that manages identity or any kind of certificates, they're very much looking at these. All right, so let's talk about them. So this is a list. It's 1 through 16. We're not going to go through all 16 right here because not all 16 can you interact with solely with OpenSSL. Most of them rely on you at minimum having access to some Active Directory credential. Doesn't have to be doesn't have to be privileged, but it does have to be valid. So there are 16 total. The ones that are highlighted, there's 8 that are highlighted. All of these can be fully enumerated, and most of them can also be exploited solely with OpenSSL. So half the list with one tool. Okay, so let's get into ESC1. ESC1 is enrollee supply subject. So this is a setting that exists within the template itself. So the certificate template says that an enrollee can actually set what the SAN is. So what this means is I'm Darryl Baker at somedomain.com. I can request a certificate essentially for any other SAN that exists. I can say I'm administrator. I can say I'm a domain admin. I can say that I'm anybody, anything I want to be. Typically, you want a template that includes the EKU that allows for authentication, and there's typically 3 of them, either client authentication, smartcard logon, or any purpose, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You don't need this. What this does is, as it says, it allows for authentication. But if your purpose isn't to authenticate to something, there's a lot of malicious stuff that you can do without authenticating. For instance, introducing valid signed code that's actually malicious. Spinning up a server or service and using a certificate for server authentication, right? So there are other things that you can do. However, as an attacker or as a red teamer, this is what you want. And as a blue teamer, these are the things you want to make sure that you lock down and you understand which one of your certificates have these EKUs in place. Here at the bottom, we've got, this low, medium privilege user has the ability to enroll for certificates. This is just saying that this is going to be a certificate template that like your average user or your computer account or whomever can enroll for a certificate for. It's not a requirement, but typically this is what you're looking for, right? Because the end goal as a red teamer is prevesc. Your end goal as a blue teamer is to stop that from happening. Another thing that ADCS allows is some mitigations. There are signature checks that can be put in place. They're not in place by default, and I've never seen one in the wild. There are manager approvals. I probably see that 30% of the time, but most of the time manager approvals are not in place. What a manager approval does is, even if an enrollee has the permissions to enroll for a certificate, before that certificate is actually issued out to the client, it has to be approved by some administrator who's been set at some other point in time. Maybe. Cool. So let's talk about the offensive workflow. This is very simple, simply because you can supply a CSR with any SAN that you want, which actually brings us to another point here. Not only can you supply any SAN that you want, you can also supply any subject that you want. So depending on the environment that this is in, if you have certain types of bindings or mappings to that certificate and you cannot modify the SAN itself, you can absolutely map it to the subject, and vice versa. So your typical mitigations for this are going to be that you want to disable that being able to supply your own SAN by the enrollee. That's the first thing. Manager approvals. This is iffy for a lot of people. A lot of times in Microsoft environments, the ability to be able to issue these certificates automatically is needed, especially when it comes to joining machines that have fallen off the domain, etc. But anywhere that you can, you want to require manager approvals. You want to add those additional security checks as well. Restrict the people that have the ability to enroll for a certificate. Does that account actually need to enroll for a certificate? In Windows Server 2016, while this is a useful setting, it can also hurt you, and we'll talk about it later. The enroll on behalf setting actually came into play. So if you have the correct permissions, you have the ability to enroll a certificate on the behalf of any other principal in your environment. So if I'm a domain admin, and let's say I've got an IoT device or something else like that running under a service account, I myself can then enroll that device on its behalf. That device does not need access to enroll for any certificates at all. All right, so this is how OpenSSL kind of plays out in this one. It's not that exciting because literally it's just a normal CSR as we see all the time. But what you don't see if you're familiar with the Windows world is the ability to set that subject, the ability to add the text to set the subject alternative name, and to specify what type of subject alternative name that you want to put in there. And this is where this vulnerability comes into place. So here I've provided both the subject as well as the SAN. Where it says other name and you see that OID that's there, that OID is correlating to the fact that I am going to provide a UPN, which is the administrator at domain.local. So as a SAN, I'm going to use that UPN. Very simple from a blue teamer side to see if this is in your environment. Look at your certs. You can literally grep for the SAN. You can grep for subject alternative names. Do they match? Should they be there? Do the subject alternative names match the identity of the requester? Those types of things. All right, moving on to ESC2. Okay, moving on to ESC2. This was actually something that was extended from ESC1. So in this particular situation, it's not that the template allows you to put any SAN that you want in place. It's that the EKU is set for any purpose. So it might be a certificate for a low-level user. It might be a certificate for whatever. But that certificate can be used for anything that you want as long as in that CSR, you specify the EKU that you want to use. So it might have been originally issued out for code signing. On your CSR, you can request it and say, I actually want to use it with an EKU for client authentication. Now I can authenticate to the domain using that certificate. Again, you have to have enroll permissions. For most of these, if you're going to pull the certificate yourself, which is required in most cases, you do need the enroll permission. Luckily enough, in Active Directory, everybody has their enroll permission. So by default, that makes it nice and easy. Again, this is where those constraints come into place for the manager approvals and such, because even if you have a very, very insecure template, it still won't be issued unless another set of eyes took the time to look at it. Again, so with this workflow, it's very similar to the last workflow, except for instead of specifying, what that SAN is, we're actually just going to specify what EKU we want to use. We don't have the ability to change the SAN, but we do have the ability to change how that certificate is being used in the environment. So this is really simple function that's here. All it's looking for, it's looking for the presence of the any purpose EKU or the presence of no EKU. So what's interesting is if you find a Windows certificate and it doesn't have any EKUs at all that are present, this is by default known as a subordinate CA certificate. So what that means is you can use that certificate to sign other certificates. So even if this is a low-level certificate, it might have the ability to be able to sign for a certificate that has more privileges or a certificate that can do other things. Now, by default, you are limited as to what you're able to do with these additional issued certificates because the subordinate CA certificate will not be part of NT Authority certificates object inside of Active Directory. That's not a thing by default, but if you have access to Active Directory, it's a really good backdoor. Again, though, without the ability to authenticate or log on to the domain, it does not stop you from using that as a valid certificate for server authentication, for code signing, and other things like that. So it is still very dangerous. One of the reasons why it's included in the list. Again, with blue teamers, you want to look at these certificates, look at the EKUs. Is this certificate being used for the way that it was originally intended? Do you leave backdoors open to modify these EKUs or to modify these SANs? This is a fun one. This is my favorite. So this is ESC3, chaining via certificate request agent. If I find this, it's like you're done. You don't want this. But it is it's very common. You just have to use it properly. And this is pertaining to that new ability to enroll a certificate on behalf of another principal. So this is allowed by a setting known as a certificate request agent setting. There's the OID for it, so you can easily query or enumerate an environment and look for that OID to see if any certificates that have been issued have the ability to request other certificates. Not only can these certificates request other certificates, they can request those certificates on behalf of any other principal, including admins, enterprise admins, domain admins. In fact, it can actually request a certificate for its own CA itself and become its own CA. So that's a fun one as well. Again, you also want to make sure that you have those signatures in place and manager approval and things like that. The reason why I keep putting these on the slides and I keep talking about it is because it is a very simple thing to put in place to, at minimum, mitigate a lot of these types of attacks. But the reason we're talking about it is because more times than not, they're not in place. And this is one of those kind of big paintbrush strokes where you can solve this for all of your templates that ever get sent, or if you never do it, none of your templates are ever going to be secure. With the ability of this, though, like I said, not only can you request a certificate that this certificate has access to and sign for it, you can do it for any principal that exists. So essentially, you are your own CA, and you get a cert, you get a cert, you get a cert for anything that you want. And up until that CA chain is killed, there's really not much that you can do about it without directly revoking that certificate. All right, moving right along. So ESC3. The attacker first obtains a certificate that has that request agent in it. It can use that certificate to then use a CSR. With that CSR, you can go ahead and sign any other certificates that you want. You really do want to avoid delegating those request agent privileges, which is the permission that's required to enroll on behalf. Typically, that should be, I wouldn't even say domain admins. I would say this needs to be restricted to either specific accounts, like a service account that's used for this, or enterprise admins. For those of you who may not know, a best practice in Active Directory is for all of your enterprise admins to almost never sit in that enterprise admin group. Anytime they need to do something that requires those privileges, they get put into the group, they do what they have to do, they get removed from the group. But those are really the only ones that need to be able to enroll a certificate on behalf of another principal, and especially have access to all of your certificates and to all of your principals. You can restrict this on a template by template basis. You can also restrict this CA-wide, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But the main thing for this is really to just make sure that you're looking at these certificates, seeing what types of EKUs are present, and making sure that you don't have the ability to, sorry, went back, one too many. Make sure that you don't have the ability to sign for other certificates unless that was the intended behavior for that certificate that you were using. So very easy here. You find a certificate that has this setting in place, or you find a certificate that allows you to set that EKU, which we talked about in ESC2. Allows you to create your own CA cert that you can then use for signing for another certificate. Again, this certificate that comes out is not going to be able to be used for authentication, but it can be used for all other things inside your environment because it is a valid certificate. Now, if our certificate down here, the agent.pim, if we were somehow to get a backdoor into Active Directory, or maybe we had access prior to this and we're using this for persistence or something along that line, that's when we would add permissions to that NT-auth certificate objects in Active Directory. That would then allow for any certificate that's signed by the subordinate CA certificate to be used for pretty much anything at that point. Now it's just a normal certificate, and that CA cert is acting, excuse me, that subordinate CA cert is acting the same way as your other subordinate CA certs in your environment. No different. ESC6. This is a bad one. I've never seen this one in the wild. I've heard about it. It's you know how that saying goes, that for every sign that you see, there's a reason why that sign's there. It's because somebody did it. So this does exist. And what this is kind of an expansion onto ESC3. So with ESC3, that was a template that had the ability to become a subordinate CA and then sign other certificates. With this one, this is on your certificate authority itself, and it's actually a property of the certificate authority that says that when this CA issues out certificates, the field for the SAN is capable of being edited. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody has the ability to it. This isn't a Boolean field of like true, false. There are levels of permissions, but the fact that you're using this flag, actually, it raises, for lack of a better word, it raises a lot of other red flags because it is something that's set across the entire CA. And so for every single certificate that's issued from the CA, at minimum, some principals have some ability to modify the SAN in some way. And that gets a little bit more important as we start talking about mappings. So an attacker goes ahead, crafts that CSR, goes ahead and injects the disallowed SAN, just like we saw in ESC3. You can go ahead and issue out another cert if you'd like to. You can sign into things if you want to. This is a very, very bad scenario. And unless you're actually looking for this inside of your logs for the CA itself, you're really not going to see this because this mechanism that works, again, as a setting on the computer object. It's not like a setting that comes into place that you'll see come across your EDR or come across any kind of setting like that. You have to actually know what the settings are across the objects inside of Active Directory. So if you see certificates getting signed by all these subordinate CAs that don't exist, look here. And here we go. Same thing as before. Remember, the subject here is just a normal user. Doesn't matter because I'm going to go ahead and supply the UPN for administrator, and I will be able to get a certificate that I can use as that administrator. I can get a certificate that I can use as pretty much any principal at that point because you have essentially opened the door for your CA to say, sure, I will sign anything for anybody. Blue teamers. The easiest way is to look at the SANs of your certificates, make sure those SANs are SANs that should have certificates, right? If you have some highly privileged account that's out there that never uses certificates, why is it getting certificates issued to it? Why does it have a certificate? Make sure that your revocation lists are updated. Make sure you understand what is allowed and what's not allowed. And then, of course, you want to make sure that those SANs match the identity of the person or the user requesting that identity. And of course, the reason why I bring that up is because that UPN to SAN mapping is one of the things that makes ADCS so unique as opposed to the way that we request certificates for anything else. Typically, SANs aren't that dangerous outside of what the specific SAN is, or if you're using like a wildcard for a domain or something like that. But in this case, it is because it maps directly to a principal, in which case it can map to a privileged principal as well. ESC9. So ESC9 is no security extension at all. So not EKUs. The EKUs might be in place. This certificate might be used for code signing or something else like that. Security extensions, this is another Microsoft-y thing. This is another way that Microsoft adds in other pieces of security to make sure that not just any object in Active Directory can interact with the certificate objects in malicious ways. So typically, this flag, no security extension, will be missing for the MSPKI enrollment flag, which is inside of the object itself in Active Directory. So with OpenSSL, you won't see this. You won't know that this is here by default. The strong certificate binding enforcement, not set to 2 or 1. Generally speaking, if you see that set to 0, if you have the ability to see that inside of Active Directory, that's a bad day for everybody. By default, it is set to 1. A lot of environments have it set to 2 as well, which is a security level. It's actually more secure than your default 1. The security mapping methods here, this UPN flag, this hex 4, just pertains to the fact that it doesn't really care about what's going on with UPN. It's not doing strict UPN mapping to the SAN. All of that is to say that you have these objects that live in Active Directory, and then you have the certificates itself. Right now, we're looking at the permissions of the object itself and how the permissions around that object work. In this case, we have not used any of the security settings that are available to us to ensure that no other principal can interact with these objects in ways that we did not initially intend. So essentially, security's there. It could do something, but it's not actually using any of the capability that it could. So typical things that you would normally catch very easily get by with very little to no work. So ESC9, because it doesn't enforce the certain types of security checks, like I said, you can bypass anything. Everything that we've talked about so far, you can bypass. You can bypass the EKU check. You can bypass OID checks. You can bypass the SAN checks. You can create a CSR, any type of CSR that you want. And because of that, that means you can request and get issued a certificate, any certificate that you want inside of an environment. In fact, when this is in place, you cannot do this natively alone with OpenSSL, but there are other built-in binaries inside of Microsoft that if you did have enough privileges, you can actually start really customizing the way that some of the certificates, and especially your subordinate CA certificates, are being issued out. And it's a really good form of persistence because all of these certificates that are being issued out in every single one of the situations that I'm talking about, they're all valid. Right, like you can do your checks. It doesn't matter what you use to do the checks. These are all valid certificates that have been issued out to the principals that they're supposed to be issued out to. The issue is not, a matter of security with, cryptography, PKI, SSL, or anything else like that. This is just a matter of operations and the way that these settings and these security frameworks are being applied. So nice and easy. Just look at the certificate. Does it have any security extensions associated with it? If anything comes back, as a red teamer, I'm going to look through all those security extensions, see if any of them are useful to me. If I see that nothing comes back, which means there's no security extensions at all, oh, I'm golden. I can do anything I want with the certificate. Depending on what comes back, I'll know which types of things that I can do with this certificate. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to move a little bit faster. All right, so that brings us to ESC10. So this is weak certificate mapping, and this is mapping that SAN to the SID, mapping that SAN to the UPN. So again, all that stuff happens in the background for you as an administrator, but typically anything that Windows or Microsoft does for you easily in the background is probably not that secure. So you should go check it and add in the proper security for your implementation. So in this case, strong certificate binding enforcement is set to 0, meaning no strong mapping is enforced. Certificate mapping methods is also set to that 4 again, which we saw in the last one. Long story short, this means that you can use partial names or wildcards inside of that SAN. So let's say the full UPN for administrator is administrator@domain.local. I might be able to get away with wildcard admin and let Active Directory find who admin should be associated with. And if admin has the ability to request that certificate, I'll go ahead and get that admin certificate issued to me. This is a fun one because you can just brute force an entire environment based around common administrative names. It either works or it doesn't. Nice and easy. Again, with that being said for the brute forcing, that's also something I've never seen flagged on an EDR. So if anybody is on an EDR team or anything else like that, I have never seen an influx of certificates being requested trigger something. Now, the use of a same certificate or the use of multiple certificates within a set time period will absolutely flag systems. But just simply because your environment is issuing out all of these new certificates on a Tuesday morning, that's not going to flag anything unless you're looking for that. All right, so with the offensive workflow, again, Windows maps those certificate accounts to the UPNs associated with the requester by default. It can be mapped to other things, but Windows by default uses loose mapping. By default, you can use wildcards. By default, I don't have to type administrator. I can type admin. I don't necessarily have to type service, depending on my version of Windows. I can type SVC. It's not case sensitive, right? We got a lot of Linux users in here, I assume, right? Because OpenSSL, Windows does not care. This also matters when you're using these certificates in between Linux machines and Windows machines. You can get different behavior with the certificate that's being presented. So mitigations. You want to always enforce strict certificate to account mapping. This is a very easy thing to do within the certificates MMC within Active Directory. You don't want wildcards. Certificates are there for a reason. They shouldn't be able to be mapped to anything that is just close to a name or anything else like that. If you have to use it, again, this is where those additional approvals and things like that come into place, because it's a very easy thing to stop as long as you're doing additional checks for when this happens. All right, so this is what it looks like. I have no idea if admin@corp.local is the email address. I just know that the domain is corp.local, right? So I'm going to try admin. I'm going to try SQL. I'm going to try SQL admin. I'm going to try service. I'm going to try SVC. And I'm just going to keep throwing things at it and hope that eventually I will get a certificate. And I can do all of that without having any kind of inside knowledge to this environment, aside from the domain name, which typically you can just pick up from the website, right? Really cool. Really scary, and you'd be surprised the amount of wildcards that you can actually use for this. I have seen in place only in labs, not in the wild, where people have modified some of the levels of restriction that you have around this mapping to make it stick a little bit better. And then I've also seen research papers that have come out by close friends of mine where, yeah, you can get around all of that. I don't know if you noticed in one of the earlier examples that I had, I specified for the UPN that I was using UTF. So that implies that I can use different types of symbols in order to represent the string for admin@corp.local. I can use wingdings. I can use emojis, emoticons, uppercase, lowercase, whatever else, and hope that I map to something else in the binary. ESC 13. So there are two different types of policies that can be added additionally to these certificates. You have issuance policies, and then you have application policies. Issuance policies, they specify the behavior of a certificate during the time of enrollment, and what the policy, what the certificate is going to do, or what it should be issued for. What's dangerous about this is one useful thing you can use is that you can link a certificate template to a group. So if you know that a certificate is only used with a specific security group in your environment, or only used with a specific set of principles, you can have it to where when that certificate is issued, it is always automatically going to use the SANs for those groups or for those principles. OpenSSL cannot see what groups things are being linked to. But within the certificate itself, you can see the OID that's being used to see if an issuance policy is in place. And if an issuance policy is in place, again, that mapping is already set in the back end. So as long as you have the capability of being able to enroll for that certificate, it will automatically map that SAN to a privileged group. So if you have the ability to just get this certificate issued, whatever group that it's mapped to, you'll get mapped with. So again, this is one of those where you don't need to see the Active Directory side. Very easy script, in a nice little do while script to just go through this, and you either get a hit or you don't. Again, this isn't something that's going to send off many EDRs or anything else like that unless you're looking for an influx of certificates. And in fact, the actual enumeration for this can happen completely offline because you can just look at certificates that exist on the servers themselves. So this is what it looks like, just specifying, using a CSR, and we're specifying the OID there, right? So this OID is saying that it's using an issuance policy. I'm hoping that this issuance policy is going to go ahead and then map my normal user CN to some privileged group somewhere else. Again, we can grep for that. Certificate policies are known as certificate policies right in the certificate, so it's easy enough to see that. It's kind of a pattern going on here, right? Like we're just looking at these certificates, looking for these things that are misconfigured, and then we are going from there. ESC 15, arbitrary application policy. Application policy similar to the issuance policy, except for it's once the certificate has already been issued, it's what can the certificate do. Now, application policies, they supersede EKUs. So it doesn't matter what EKU that you have in place. If you have an application policy that's in place for client auth, you have an EKU, or you don't have the EKU for client auth, that certificate can still be used for client auth. The reason that this is important, and we're still kind of talking about this, is by default in ADCS, when you create a template, that template is a version 1 template. Version 1s are susceptible to this because you can create a CSR and just request that application policy, just by default. Anybody can. That being said, Microsoft has patched that with a template version 2. So when you create any kind of templates inside of Active Directory certificate services, you want to make sure that you always clone it. By cloning it, it will automatically upgrade from template 1 to template 2, regardless of the operating system that you have, as long as you're patched and up to date. I'm not going to go too deep into that because we're running real low on time here. This is what it looks like. By the way, all my slides and stuff are going to be available to you guys on GitHub and stuff too, so if you want to go back through all of this. Long story short, red teamers and blue teamers have the ability to use OpenSSL pretty much the same way, right? To craft CSRs, to craft certificates, to interact with these EKUs and OIDs. The difference is you don't typically want the red teamers to do that. You don't want the malicious actors to do that. And blue teamers, you should be aware of the fact that you don't need access to the ADCS snap-ins inside of Active Directory. You don't need to be a domain admin or whatever else to look at most of the checks that are currently associated around Active Directory certificate services. Tools and scripts, just quickly, if you want to go to my GitHub there, I've created 2 scripts. One is just a bash script, and one is Python. Essentially what they do is they enumerate for all of these different vulnerabilities that I've talked about inside of the script, and it'll give you a nice little printout as to what you have going on in your environment. This can be used for good or bad. I don't judge. It also includes a PowerShell script so that if you do have an Active Directory environment in place, all you have to do is install the ADCS role, run the PowerShell script, and it'll go ahead and create that vulnerable ADCS environment for you, and then you can start doing testing with it there. Common certificate locations. Again, all of this is in my GitHub, so if you look at the GitHub, if you're not familiar with all of the different places that you can find certificates across different systems, these are the places here. This is Windows machines, and then we have just some of your common Linux machines, as well as third-party applications that also store a copy of specific types of certificates, such as browsers, Java, etc. And I think at that, I am 2 minutes and 52 seconds over, but thank you.